Welcome to Programming for Designers. This is Trish Ladd, WIP400 Platt College. Handling data with forms and HTTP. You've just input a web address into the address bar of your browser. What happens? Your browser then makes a request to the server that hosts the location of the page that you are looking for. The server then looks for or requests that page. Apache finds the file on the server, it then sees that it is a PHP page, and sends it to the PHP engine to process. If there are any calls to a database, they get executed and the data is returned to the PHP page. Once that happens, the PHP engine compiles the page as a complete HTML page, and your browser then renders it into the live DOM, from which JavaScript can further enhance interactivity. This is how a server-side language works. All the work gets done on the server and then served up to the browser. Browser to server is request. Server to browser is the response. We will be talking in more detail about the request-response sequence in the days to come, but know that it is through this process all data gets sent to and from your browser. Now here's the problem. HTTP is stateless, which means that the connection between the browser and the server is lost once the transaction ends. That means once the page is sent to the browser, it's done. HTTP is connectionless, and this direct result is that HTTP is a stateless protocol. The server and client are aware of each other only during a current request. HTTPS also does not maintain a consistent connection. The S only encrypts the data passed from the browser to the server so that a casual interception of the data cannot be read without decryption. HTTP does not have built-in support for states. For example, you cannot store if a user has been logged in or done something else. The most common solution to this problem are cookies and sessions, where we make sure that important data gets set and stored. We'll learn more about that later. PHP has several predefined variables called superglobals, and these are arrays. They are superglobals, which means that they are available in all scopes throughout a script, and there is no need to use the keyword global in order to access them within functions or methods. Each associative array has a key value pair, which means you do not need to know what index an item is at. You can just call it by its key. We will use a number of these, but not all of them. We will use get, and we will use post, and we will use cookie, and we will use session. Files and server will also be used. The first two superglobal arrays that we are going to work with are get and post. Get and post are the primary means in which you are going to have data passed to and from your server. Have you ever been to a site with a URL like this? After the domain page name, there is a question mark followed by a bunch of other characters. If you've ever been shopping on Amazon or searched on Google, you have. These are URL parameters. If you remember, parameters are basically variables. In this case, these are URL parameters, and they get stored in PHP's get superglobal array. If you remember, an array is a list. By accessing the get array, we can get values from those parameters and do something with them inside of PHP. There is a limited number of characters available in the URL window, so get is not used to pass robust amounts of data. So here we see two parameters, name and its value Bob, password and its value chicken, both of which could be gotten right here by just using the word name and getting the value of Bob, password and getting the value of chicken. You can see that these two parameters are separated by an ampersand. Another example of this is when we have not yet changed our permalinks in WordPress. You'll see something in the URL like p equals 34. That 34 would be the ID of the post, and that tells WordPress to go to the database and get the content for post ID 34. We haven't really started talking about post yet. The main difference between get and post is that get has its values visible in the URL window, but post does not. It sends its data to a hidden superglobal array, and for this reason, it's considered more secure. It's not bookmarkable, and it's good to be used for anything that is sensitive or permanent. So let's talk a little more in detail. Here we have a form, and you can see up above the method is get. Now, In the get value, that means that those values are going to get passed to the PHP page into the URL window. And you can see the name value var1. Whatever gets input into that input will be the value of scalar underscore get var1. So if its value is something, that's what will be stored in scalar underscore get var1. Same goes for var2. You can use URL parameters in hyperlinks in order for them to process data as required or as needed. So in this case, we have a URL parameter called link, and its value is 1, and that might have specific significance to the page that we're linking it to. Maybe link 2 will produce a different result. With the exceptions noted earlier, post and get are not very different. Here you can see that we're using the same form. The only difference is that the method is post. And the method must be post if you want to access it via the post superglobal array. The default for all forms is get. So here you can see we have post var1, it's post, that's what we're using. So we're going to use this post global array in order to get its value. Now we're going to start talking about request. The request superglobal array. This can be used when you cannot use get or post or cookie alone. If you have mixed data going into your page that all needs to be processed, you can use the request superglobal array. Request registers get, then post, then cookie in that order. If any are using the same key name, you will overwrite the previous data. So if you have a cookie key name with the same key name as a key name in your post data, it will get overwritten by the cookie data because it comes last. For this reason, request is not recommended. So let's check on your learning. What does it mean to say that HTTP is stateless? The page does not store information. What is the primary difference between get and post? Get has visible data in the URL while post hides the data. What superglobal array data does request retrieve? Get, post, and cookie in that order. Now we are going to start talking about server-side form validation and sanitation and why it is so important. The first rule of user-submitted data: do not trust user input, period. Don't trust your users. Because we cannot trust our users to either make innocent errors or perhaps purposeful and malicious errors, we need to validate and sanitize our data. And this ensures that we have both clean and properly formatted data. As I mentioned before, we can't trust our users. So we can use PHP validation as a final failsafe for when JavaScript has been turned off or HTML5 validation is unavailable. Validating also ensures that we have all of the data that we need and that it is in the proper format before we send it to be processed. Last but not least, the mail function is not secure, so that means that it is up to us to ensure that no viruses are spread. So why check every field? Sometimes users don't fill out all the pieces of data that we need them to fill out. So we need to make sure that we let them know that this piece of data has not been filled out. Other times, there's intentional failure, like people are trying to hack your website for whatever various reason they may have to do so. Either way, it is up to us to protect our server. So how do we do it? Well, first we do need to clean the data to sanitize the data. That is a separate process from validating. Still, very important. Next, we need to check for invalid responses. If there are anything that's wrong, empty, needs to be corrected, we need to let the user know and tell them if there is a problem. Otherwise, if everything's all good, we can then proceed with the data and process it accordingly. Here is a simple form, and we would want to check each of those 4 inputs for the type of data that we expect from them. So for example, name would probably just take a string with no HTML characters allowed. Age would be an integer, perhaps a max length of 3. An integer for zip code, a max length of 5 perhaps. And phone number, integer or string for phone number of either 10 or 13 with dashes. Here are a couple of functions that you can use that will help you validate strings. The first one just checks to see if the variable is a string. The second one determines the number of characters in the string. Stirpose checks a string for a value and will return the index of where that value is in the string, much like index of in JavaScript. There are a number of pre-built functions in PHP that will help you sanitize strings. These are just a few. HTML special chars converts things to HTML entities, strip tags removes tags from strings, and trim removes whitespace from either side of the string. Here are a couple of functions that will do the same validation for numbers. FilterVar's documentation is found on php.net, and you should check out the filter list for all the different things that we can do with FilterVar. Primarily, we'll be using it to sanitize strings and to validate URLs and emails. A quick note on how FilterVar is used. First, we put in the data that we want to sanitize. Next, we then pass the argument of what we want to do with that data. In this case, we want to sanitize the string. We can also use FilterVar in the same method for validating URLs or emails. First, we pass it the data that we want to check, and then we tell it what type of check we want it to make. When it comes to databases, we want to be extremely careful. Anything that we put into our database could permanently damage the database or our website, depending on what gets inserted. So we want to use something like MySQLi real escape string to neutralize any dangerous characters that could harm the database. And here's why. This XKCD comic 327 illustrates perfectly why we want to make sure that our database inputs are sanitized. I'm going to re-emphasize again how important it is to have both client-side and server-side validation and sanitation. Client-side technologies like JavaScript and HTML5 should be used to pre-check all form data. Every time we connect to the server, that's bandwidth that is being used by our server. Since bandwidth equates to both time and money in the re-requesting of the page and the downloading of the page, it is prudent to do as much checking you can client-side before sending the data to the server. But as I said before, sometimes for various reasons HTML5 validation or JavaScript validation may not be available, so we must also include PHP validation as our last line of defense. I can't reiterate this point enough. Don't trust your users. Validate and sanitize your data. So in summary, remember, you need both validation and sanitation. They are not the same thing. When users submit data, you need to make sure that the data is in the form in which you expect. That's validation. Before saving the data or sending the data, make sure that it's clean. That's sanitization. Overall, make sure that the right type of data filtering is on the right type of data at the right time. And use client-side code in conjunction with PHP in order to keep your data clean and your server safe. Happy coding!